So first of all, hello and welcome to the last Rock Center evening event of the 2014 academic year. My name is Evan Epstein. I'm the Executive Director of the Rock Center for Corporate Governance, which is a joint initiative between Stanford Law School and the Stanford Graduate School of Business. It's been a pretty busy year for us. This will be the 27th event of the year on campus, and the last Rock Center evening speaker series event of the year, which has been hosted traditionally on the second Monday of every month. And this is the 10th evening event. So we've hosted a lot of different topics, and we're very happy about it. Actually, our two last events of the year will be the Rock Center Program for Journalists, and next week in New York City, where we fly some of our leading faculty to New York to talk about their corporate governance research with business and finance journalists. And then finally, our 20th annual Directors College on June 22nd, 24th, which is the leading program for corporate directors of publicly traded companies in the US. So in that program, we discussed during 3 days with about 250 to 300 directors and C-level executives the most relevant issues affecting corporate boards and their duties. But today, we're very excited to have David Larker, who is the senior faculty of the Rock Center and based out of the GSB, to talk about some of his leading research on succession planning, along with a very distinguished panel of speakers that I'll let him introduce. We're also especially grateful to Heidrick & Struggles, the global executive search firm. They have been great supporters of the Rock Center, and this event has been sponsored by their firm. I'd like to thank specifically John Thompson, who's in this panel, who's not only the vice chairman of Heidrick & Struggles Global CEO and Board Directors Practice, but he's also been a great friend and supporter of the Rock Center. So I hope you enjoy the program today, and if you have any questions about the Rock Center, please do not hesitate to let me know. And so please help me in welcoming David Larker and our panelists today on the topic of CEO succession planning, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Thank you.
Yes, I'd also like to welcome you to the program. We're always excited to have a little bit of evening program. Again, I'm Dave Larker. I'm a senior faculty of the Rock Center, but I live in the business school. We have a great panel. I'm going to moderate the panel. And the idea is we're going to have each panelist talk for maybe 5 minutes, but we always know that smears over into 10 minutes. And then maybe a little back and forth on the panel, and then open it up for questions. In the panel, we have Homer Barani. We brought her here even though she's up at that Weldon institution across the bay, the Cal Bears. An expert in basically organizational flexibility, but other kind of behavioral dynamics. Brad Buss, Cypress Semiconductor. I think if I read the press releases correctly, you're transitioning out of that, or that?
No, I take succession so to the heart that I succeeded myself on Friday.
Okay. so he'll be completely uninhibited with his remarks. Yeah.
I'm very relaxed.
And he could provide certainly a great overview from the board perspective. He's on the board of Tesla, obviously a founder managed company with, I don't think they're actively in succession planning, but I'm sure there's
you'll find out.
Lots of issues. John Thompson, no doubt known to many of you, a very well-known, very distinguished search consultant, has been involved in some of the largest searches, both here and on the East Coast, at Heidrick & Struggles, being a vice chairman. And Scott Saslow. Scott is the founder and director of the Institute of Executive Development. It's a consulting company that does a variety of talent assessment, behavioral training, succession planning, sorts of issues for lots of top companies. And the reason we're here tonight a little bit is that Scott fortunately wanted to do some research together at Stanford, and so our group got together with him, Brian Tan, Michelle Gutman, and myself, and his group, and try to provide a little data around succession planning. Governance issues are always highly debatable. They're controversial. The problem is there's usually not that much data. There's a lot of opinion, but we try to provide a little bit of data around this. Let me just give you a few highlights on this thing. It's actually a pretty, I would say, unsettling picture of succession planning. One of the things we find is that every company has a succession plan. There's a book, there's a manual, it has words in it. Whether it's actually actionable or not is at best open to question. Something really happened. Are the rules well established? Who does what? Who are some of the people who are on the short list? Is that how you'd actually behave or not? We don't find that to be that pleasing. We also don't find that many companies have a good idea who's going to be the guy who's going to replace someone that's outgoing. It could be the proverbial hit by the bus, but it could be the natural planning of who's going to fill these positions. And we don't really find that there's lots of evidence on that. One very disturbing feature is, I think, rather than looking at succession planning as a strategic activity, something where the board surely could create value, it's become more of a compliance function. We check the box. Indeed, we have a succession plan. It's in a binder. Just because it's covered with dust shouldn't make you feel that it is not important. We don't find that there's a lot of, I would say, talent in the boardroom to evaluate the CEO. I was mentioning to Cindy Zollinger on the way in that one of the things that you find is that boards use auditors to do auditing. They hire consultants to do compensation. They bring strategy consultants in. But when it comes to succession planning, which argue is one of their two key functions, they're happy to go it alone. Now, whether there's people on the board that actually have the skills, they have led succession plans or things like that is open to question. And finally, one of the things we find especially interesting, both from a research but also from a consulting side, is what's the role of the outgoing CEO? That person can be a really valuable person to help the process along, help distinguish who's going to be the next CEO. On the other hand, that person can really be a painful member of the process, depending on whether they've thought about what they're going to do after they leave, what's their personality types, things like that. So these are some of the high-level findings, and rather than go through all these, let me just turn it over to the panelists, and let me ask Homa to kick it off. Thank you.
Thank you, David, and good evening. It's a pleasure to be with you here today. I love the title of this session, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And so I was thinking about what has been my experience as both an academic, as a board member, as an advisor, with succession planning practices. And I would say the good has three distinctive features. Number one, it is collaborative. It is a relationship, a partnership between the board and the CEO. It is also integrated. It is not a one-off activity. It is linked to the business strategy. It is linked to the organizational footprint, and it's linked to the talent practices of the company in question. And number three, it is a simple process that's continuously improved. So let me give you an example of the good. The company I'm thinking about has a strategic planning conversation once a year between the board and the CEO, where there is a deep dive into the business strategy for the coming year and beyond, where the CEO discusses the organizational structure and the footprint that he or she envisions going forward, and engages with the board about talent practices at multiple levels, the C-suite, as well as the CEO successor candidates. It is a simple process because even though it's a deep dive once a year, the conversation continues at every board meeting. So the good has those three distinctive features as I have experienced it. The bad. The key words I would use for the bad are ad hoc, reactive, and disconnected. Ad hoc because, it does not happen on a regular basis. It happens in response to crises. So performance is bad one quarter, we need to talk about succession, the CEO may not be good. It is disconnected because it is not linked to the overall business strategy for the future. It is not linked to the organizational structure that is there to support the business strategy, and then succession conversation takes place in isolation. It's disconnected. Let's get to the ugly. The ugly, in my experience, is emotionally charged and political. It becomes about the conversation between the CEO and the board in a disconnected way. The conversation goes underground. Instead of being an open, transparent, robust discussion, it's one-off conversations between the CEO and this board member and that board member. There's a lot of rumor, there's gossip, and it becomes emotionally charged. So just wanted to give you a little flavor at a high level of the key sort of traits that I have observed as I look at the good, bad, and ugly. And when I look at the report, David, I notice that a lot of what you're describing go into the bucket of the bad and potentially the ugly. So it is interesting, we don't have many cases of the good that we can talk about. But at the end of the day, I think, as you said, it is something extremely strategic, and it's not just a compliance function for the business. So those are just some high-level initial observations.
Brad?
My turn?
Yeah.
No, I agree 100%. As someone who's been on the board and also someone that gets evaluated as a succession, I say it varies depending on the company. I think the Valley is a very different animal than an East Coast company. Technology is very different than a 100-year-old industrial company. The other thing here, which I have a lot of familiarity with, is founder-led companies, right? So, like most things in life, there is no manual. All the data, that you came up with, I could find and slice data a different way to say this is good or that is bad. But I would say of all the board stuff I've seen in all of my years, doesn't get enough attention. I think most companies get it and they're concerned on it, and it needs to be an ongoing business process, and not just at the CEO level. In most companies, the CEO is not the one that you have to worry about. And it may not be someone on the officer team, it could be somebody below. So like at our company, we have a very detailed process. We have a founder, and he's older. Right, and we take it very seriously. We talk it, but we have one. I have one. I just mentioned I retired, and I was very happy that my successor that I've been grooming, the E staff on the board unanimously bought off on. That's my job. I mean, I believe it's a failure of management and the board if you have to go outside. Unless all of a sudden, wait a minute, you were developing a guy and the CEO or the CFO all of a sudden died. But it's a travesty, I think, when most companies have to, initiate a big search. They haven't done their job. And it's a very difficult job. I mean, it really is. And because your company can change. I could be grooming this person I brought in, and, we've changed twice in those 8 years. I was fortunate he was able to change with it and keep the go. But sometimes you start moving around too fast. But I agree 100, you said it can't be a once-a-year thing. I don't think it's a check the box. And as a board member, we ensure that we go meet these people. Okay, who are all these people? If we don't know them, we have dinners. We do dinners twice a year in a social setting. All the board members will buddy up with somebody. Okay, obviously I'm the finance guy. I go work with the finance one. And you have meetings and you get to know them so that you can weigh in. But we also bring in other board members that don't have the functional expertise that can give a critical eye. What do you think? And no one ever agrees.
Well, that's the point
very,
of a
very
robust
unusual.
conversation. Yeah.
And I think when you have the founder thing, to your point, the real big thing, whether they're the founder or the CEO, is what is their role post it? Do they go on the board? If they're already on the board, do they stay on the board? Did they become chairman? That becomes very delicate. Because it's very hard for succession to have someone looking over your shoulder all the time. And that's something that in many companies you see happens, and it's very hard to attract the right person, and then the conflict can be huge. You really, really need to manage that conflict. And you have to be upfront what your role is. You're not the top dog anymore. This is your role, that's what you're doing. And you may need someone from the board to help be in the middle between the old guy and the new guy, saying, hey, no, you're overstepping. You're not coming in the office every day. Let him make his decisions. So it's a complicated subject. It really is. And I look forward to the magic answer. I will subscribe. I'll turn it over.
Okay.
Why don't you go next, and we'll let Scott,
Scott,
or why don't you go?
clean up?
No, yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Great. Well, it's hard to disagree with Homa's platform in terms of the good, bad, and the ugly, but just to get things started here, let me just mention a couple of things. One is, I think, when CEO succession specifically, and I know this is a broader topic other than just CEO, but C-suite succession specifically, when I found it doesn't work is, like a host of reasons. You have legacy board members that are not that tied to the business anymore or may be on cruise control. But in many cases, I found that boards can collude to fail because they mismanage agreement around what they want to do. If you talk to the boards individually, which we frequently do, interview board members, we'll find that they said, yes, this is what we should be doing. But when the group gets together for a variety of reasons, they don't do it. It could be a strong founder. I don't know that. I have no idea whether that's your
Never
case.
seen that.
It could be a strong founder. It could be a bit of an insular CEO where the business has been cranking along, doing well. There hasn't been a huge performance problem, but a person may say, are we settling for too little here? Have we not defined success in the proper level? That could happen. There could be, you may have a strong chair or a strong lead director that is overpowering at the board, and people don't bring it up. For example, suppose you felt there was a problem and you were working full-time. Let's say you have a full-time job as a consultant, a C-level person, or maybe a CEO of another company, and you say, if I bring this up, the chair is going to ask me to lead a subcommittee. He says, oh my God, I don't have time for that now. I'd never see my family, my friends already. So there are some subtle emotional reasons people don't do it, even though that, if I was that person on the board, I might say, if there was an accounting defalcation issue or fraud issue, I would definitely bring it up. I don't want to be sued on this, but if there are some subtle issues around succession, it's easy to kick the can down the road. And of course, we never see that happen in Washington, right? So there are a lot of reasons people can mismanage agreement and all of a sudden find themselves where the CEO, you have a long-term CEO, where the CEO becomes ill, has a heart attack, perhaps is killed or injured in an accident. They have these hit by the bus, and I call it HBAB, hit by a bus scenarios. And there are a lot of reasons that boards can collude to fail because they mismanage agreement, they don't speak up. And that's, that could be a whole different topic. Homa could lead a seminar for us, and Scott could lead a seminar for a couple of days on that, I'm sure. There are some best practices I found, and one that I've become particularly intrigued with recently is a bit of a spin on what Brad just mentioned that I think they've been doing at Cypress, is to formally set up a relationship with a board member to meet 3 to 4 times a year. And in the case of 2 companies I'm thinking of, I won't mention them, but 2 current clients, where they have assigned a board member to meet probably at dinner 3 times a year. And these are individuals that have been identified by the board and by the CEO as potential successors with a medium term, a 5-year window. I believe 10 years windows are very difficult to find these days. Brad, you may have mentioned one of them, a long-term, maybe industrial company that's cranking along at 4 to 5% a year growth, or a tech company. Amazingly, I think you look at the last 25 years and find the large tech companies in the Valley, there are only 5 or 6 that were here 25 years ago. So, companies change over, and in many ways, as Homa might say, we have an ecosystem here in Silicon Valley versus just a group of companies. But in assigning these, they're required to meet, and they're required to write an assessment of how that conversation went. And when at the formal meeting, they have a formal meeting along succession and strategy. It's the same meeting. Both these companies have the same basic format. The CEO discusses each of those individuals, and the board member meets, discusses their observations of that individual along with the CEO. And as you know, if you say, I've heard so many times, I'm sure most of you have too, Brad will be ready in 2 more years, right? And it's 24 months from now. And said, if we haven't really planned anything, Brad is 2 years older. Nothing's happened. So it takes a very proactive aspect and a robust, rigorous, continuous issue. I believe succession planning is really to create a sustainable organization. And I really think while most people talk about 10 years, that probably 5 is more relevant. I'm not trying to be too granular here, but I think 5 is more relevant in doing it. But I do like the mentoring process on an assigned basis, and every year that rotates. So if Brad has me, if he's a board member and I'm a C-level person, let's say I'm the CFO, and I'm on the CEO succession target list, he may meet with me 3 times this year, and Scott, another board member, may meet with me 3 times next year. So they rotate that, so one person doesn't continually have that same relationship. I think it builds a more robust, and it really allows you to get to know those individuals much better than just having them attend a cocktail party at a strategy meeting or do an occasional presentation to the board. All of those are useful, but I think these in-depth, for instance, a dinner, a lunch, trying to spend at least an hour and a half, 2 hours together really allows you to see that person in a different way. The last thing I'd say is this hit by the bus. I usually encourage CEOs to also, as part of their process, is to submit names formally to their board that they should consider, that should be on their target list if the CEO was hit by a bus, any type of scenario. That CEO could be recruited to another job by, one of those search firms, which is, when we talk about those guys, that could happen. But in any case, I found that's very helpful for the board to be aware of people that the current CEO thinks that could succeed as an outsider. And why would you ever bring in an outsider? Well, our philosophy is always go with the insider if possible. All things being equal, you would always choose an insider for all the obvious reasons, transform the culture, whatever. But if a company is broken, if it needs a transformation, or if it's a technology company and it's stuck, let's say you happen to be a certain computer security company, and your suite of products include virus protection, but it doesn't include really anything else. Can you choose an insider? That has real risk, because how quickly can you make a change? Do you go find an executive that has familiarity with another technology and can you buy that company and get the new CEO with it? Can you recruit an insider that left 2-3 years ago, went to another company? You could bring them back. That's a different type of insider. That's an insider, once removed. You could potentially bring them back, and NASDAQ just did that recently with one of their former executives. So you can go back and take a look at that if you'd like. But let me just stop there. But I think this hit by the bus scenario of having a CEO present that to the board as a formal process and monitor those people, and also have this specific board mentoring project where the board member shares the review at that meeting that you may have, and it could be twice a year, it doesn't have to be once a year, but shares that with the board member that did the assessment, had those 3 dinners or 3 meetings with that board member. And lastly, I think the succession topic should come up at every board meeting, not just once a year. And I can tell you the best companies that I know that are doing CEO succession that I would judge very well. New CEO starts, they discuss succession at the first board meeting, which seems a little out of place, but the companies that I knew do best, they do it the first board meeting. They start talking about succession at the first meeting where a new CEO starts.
Scott?
Okay, great. Some fantastic comments. I'll try to build on them. Through this research and other work that we do when we work with our clients and try to look at all the practices they may be doing as it relates to succession and executive development, a few things have sort of popped out, for me at least. One is certainly everyone's head and heart is in the right place, so to speak. So there's been a little bit of commentary on the state of affairs, and I think we are in a situation where the state of affairs aren't exactly that pretty, or to put it another way, they can be pretty ugly, and that is dangerous. I mean, that is a serious risk to organizations, and that's some lost opportunity. But every time we have the conversation with board members and with the top executives and with the HR executives, 201, they're all very keen to make improvements and do things as best they can. Now, often where the rubber hits the road, they simply don't know what that really looks like. And that's where hopefully these sort of venues and the work that we do to try to get the word out will actually make a difference. But that's a good starting place if we want to try to be an optimist looking at this. The other interesting thing that comes out is, and there are a decent amount, I would say probably about 25% of organizations, they will admit, hey, we're not in a great place with succession. We're not really happy with the activities that we're doing. We're not really happy with the results, however we may measure those results. And so again, we're sort of, our eyes and ears are open and we want to make some changes. So I think that's actually, relatively speaking, good compared to my next point here. What troubles me the most actually is where I think the bulk of organizations are, and that's somewhere in the 30 to 40% range, where they don't really know how robust their succession activities are. There's a huge discrepancy, even within the same organization, around how strong succession is. What are the processes we're doing that really make a difference? Do we have a cohesive strategy? What are the metrics we're using to actually track the impact of our succession? We've gotten widely different results asking some of the same questions to different board members, to different incumbent C-suite leaders around what's happening and is it working. And for us, that's an important starting point, right? If any organization wants to make a change and go from where they may be today to some future state and improve the state of affairs, you have to know where you're starting from. So we think this is a really important element. We do it through this objective benchmarking that we call the index, to try to look at all the practices that we've ever heard or seen organizations doing and compare companies to that and say, where are you actually shaking out? Another thing that we notice is, I think we've hit on this one already, but there's a bit of an underappreciation, I would say, especially for board members, of what it really takes to run succession well. A lot of underestimating, I would say, of the time involved, the difficulty, and the challenge at hand, and how complex it really can be to make it from something that's really consistent and built into the DNA, if you will, and not an episodic one-time thing. Hand in hand with that, we sometimes see what I'll call some over-delegation. So again, board members, they take their job very seriously. They want to do the right thing for the company. They know that CEO succession is probably the primary thing, their primary responsibility, hiring and firing of the CEO. But often they will over-delegate. The whole succession process, if you break it down, there's about 4 or 5 different chunks that comprise the overall process. And sometimes we see organizations that will sort of delegate the whole thing, either to an outside search firm or professional services firm, or maybe to HR, which may or may not have the ability to really run the process, quite honestly. I think it's really important that the board understands what's in the process itself, which components can and should be delegated and done in concert with different constituents, both internal to the organization and outside. The third point I'd like to make is that of customization. So, as I sometimes like to say, if you want generic results, then just use generic practices. Yes, we're going to talk about some best practices here. You can read about them in all the research that's ever been written about succession planning. But at the end of the day, it's applying those practices to your organization. It's thinking about where you are in your economic cycle. It's thinking about the culture of the organization, the industry in which you play. And it's carving out a specific charter. Why are you doing succession? Is it risk management? Are we trying to, have a good story for our institutional investors? And/or do we think succession can actually drive the organization forward by putting top talent at the top of the organization? And/or. But these are some fundamental questions that really need to be agreed upon before you start building your strategies underneath there, and then ultimately coming up with some metrics to track the process. That was, a final point here, something that I was a little bit surprised by, the disparity of metrics. In the cases where metrics were used, which is certainly not everywhere, the disparity, even within the same organization. What really counts? Is it how long roles are vacant for? Is it how many successors we have? Are there some other ways that we're measuring the process? Is it a subjective evaluation? Do we think we have the right successors for the C-suite? These, I think, are, again, as John would say, the organizations that seem to have a good beat on this and are doing this well, I think, are the ones that have really taken these ideas and customized them for their specific organization where they are.
Yeah, that's great. All good comments. I want to just give you my pet peeves very quickly. One of the things that drives me sort of crazy about succession planning, we use this term "ready now." Is the person ready now to be the CEO? Well, the answer is nobody's ready now because they've never done that job before. But we have this idealized view of what the CEO is like. This is sort of obvious, but we also focus on the CEO, but it's really a multi-person event. If there's different candidates inside, there's going to be turnover, throughout the ranks of the organization. In big organizations, you have to worry about that a little bit. Like, if someone's selected, you have someone that's going to fill the gap in the +2, +3 level position. The other thing, I'd be interested in the panel's comments. I mean, the ones I've been involved in, if it's an inside-outside search, so you're entertaining, external people as well as internal, the discussion always seems to me to be biased against the internal candidate because you've seen this person as a junior person, you've seen mistakes, et cetera, and you idealize the outside candidate because, it's like, wow, they've done fantastic, but you haven't seen them in this junior role. And I think I think the reason you want kind of outside people to help come in is to guard against these kind of inherent biases. And as all the panelists have said, there's got to be a process in place that makes some sense. We've done a little work. It's not in the surveys, but if there's a succession event, it doesn't have to be a death, but someone's terminated, and that person's replaced by the internal candidate. If you have a real succession plan, you got to be able to announce that person in a day or two. Okay, if you have to wait months to do the internal candidate, that's a bad sign. And I can tell you, the stock market downgrades you substantially for the internal candidate if it doesn't look like you have a succession plan. So those are kind of my pet peeves, but yeah.
I just want to pick up on your first pet peeve about ready now. I mean, I think of succession planning as a double-edged sword. It's on the one hand an offensive practice. You want to select the candidates best for the business going forward. On the other hand, it's a defensive business because you do need to have emergency planning. You do need to have what if somebody's hit by a bus. So I really think that, unfortunately, the optic that I see too often on the boards is very much the defensive component, which is what if somebody's hit by a bus. But that's why it's important to think proactively about what does a business need, where is it going, where is the organization, and really think about succession planning not just as a defensive compliance activity, but as an offensive growth, business driver activity, which is what I think you do at Cypress.
I would agree. That's the most important thing, again, in this valley. I mean, the average founder is not equipped to be the CEO normally of a public company, or a billion, or maybe a $10 billion one, and that's our duty as a board and the management team, quite frankly, to say, it's time to turn it over, right? I mean, one of my first boards, and I was a total independent outsider, didn't know anyone, and I'm going, this guy ain't gonna take us public. I've been there, I live it, there's no way. And we had to have those discussions,
and what happened?
It's not easy. He agreed, and
was it the good, the bad, or the ugly, or?
It was all of the above. And it's generally ugly, but it's the decision. And like you guys were saying, I think a lot of the board guys, if they're to show up every quarter, what's going on, they're not equipped to have those hard discussions. Or they're worried about it, or they're a lifestyle board member, as I call it. I don't give a shit. The guy doesn't like me, wants to fire me, fine, fire me. It doesn't matter to me. But some people, it's their job, it's prestige, whatever it may be. And I think it's harder to make those decisions. And again, like John said, well, the other thing we do, we have 3 people, because one of them's getting poached. In this valley, trust me. I mean, Google, Tesla, they're all losing people to somebody else. And if it's one of your hot players, they're gone. And then I always have a list of 2 outside guys as well. If my number one isn't ready or no one agreed, well, here you go. Here's the other two CFOs that you should talk to. And I've already had discussions with them. And I presented both of them to the board and my boss. And I was fortunate they went with the insider because I was the only outsider that's ever came to the executive staff of Cypress. And I think that's kudos to him and the board for the succession and the planning that they've done. And there's so many guys that have left there that become, we had a dinner, there was like 90 guys that had left there and were CEOs of companies. And so it's going to happen. Yeah. It happens everywhere.
I have a quick question, Dave, for John's comment about, comparing Silicon Valley with what you see. You do a lot of board searches and CEO searches. What do you see as the key differences between what goes on here in the Valley versus what you see on the East Coast, Midwest, internationally, outside of here?
I think basically it is the factor in the Valley, other than the obvious, pace of change, velocity of change. You hear that all the time. I think we would all agree. There is a difference in the Valley where product cycles tend to be, sometimes handfuls of months versus 5 years, 6 years, 8 years in some industries. It seems to me that the big difference is what I would call multidisciplinary thinking, is the board is thinking in the Valley, I think they think very broadly about, who are the disruptors, who's going to disrupt us. And I think otherwise it is like, well, we have enough power in the channel, we have enough power in R&D, we can squash, this little small A company that's trying to come up with a new compressor for a turbine engine or something. If it's a more traditional manufacturing or industrial manufacturing technology company. So I think the big difference to me is pace of change, velocity of change, and I see a lot more multidisciplinary, multivariate thinking in the Valley than I do with a lot of companies, even very successful companies on the East Coast. That there is a difference in thinking.
If it's okay with the panel, maybe we'll get some questions from the group here. Yeah.
Objectivity is a word that's been used by all of you. How do we make it is not people's objectivity, but the process objectivity? Doesn't matter who is on the board, how different people were to be there, the result will be very close to what it will be. That's I want to make sure that I get your feedback on the objectivity. But however, it cannot be completely blindly objective as well, because there's a lot of personalities involved in the organization. And if we choose one or two, it should be based on the condition, type of succession reason, what triggers the succession, whether it's someone dies, whether someone leaves, so the performance is not good. So you need to have systematic alternatives, a systematized method.
Let me kind of paraphrase that a little bit. What you want is some structured process when you make these things, and so you want something written down that's just not generic. We've all seen the job descriptions that are completely generic, and anybody could fill that. But here's the skills and competencies that we're looking for, and use that to guide the process. Maybe you guys could talk about if you don't have those, or if it's too tight or too loose.
Yeah, I mean, the way I see this manifest sometimes is in a reverse sequence than I think what's optimal. Meaning, ideally, the whole succession process, it is iterative. You want to make it collaborative. It's not episodic, et cetera. That is absolutely correct. Often what happens is it's run in reverse. In other words, and we talked about emotion, how strongly that can play a role here. So, I like John, Fred, or Sally, and I want to sort of submit them as the next candidate for X position. Let's start constructing the arguments to make them the winning candidate, as opposed to what I think ideally would be a process that starts with what are the requirements? Let's start with the organization and where it needs to be in the next 3 to 5 years. Let's start breaking that into the capabilities that are required within that position and or the executive suite to power the organization to get from A to B. And then we're going to have some objectivity in the form of multiple points of view of objective and tested standards that are used to evaluate different individuals against that set of required competencies. So I think in an ideal world, you want to see some element of it. Yes, again, it's iterative. I think where it fails, it's when organizations sort of work backwards. They sort of have a sense of who they want to be nominating or selecting, and then they sort of work backwards to construct those arguments.
We have a series of 10 major items, right? And as a subset of each one, there's 4 to 6 very terse bullets that, again, anyone could pick up and go, yeah, I understand what that means. And then you're graded on that, yellow, green, red, and it's kind of all over the place, and that evolves every year, right? And your goal is to get more greens. And if you're not moving it, like that was some of the metrics that John talked about, it's like that person isn't there, or me as the boss is not there. But one of the big sticklers, I think at the higher level, it's not experience, it's the cultural fit, it's the core values. Mm-hmm. That is a real big issue. You know, I'm a simple Midwest guy from Canada, and this valley, I keep going back, is a different animal, how people think. I mean, I've been involved in some, you know, I had a discussion with a couple people where it's just, that's just wrong. Where people here will just flip it off very easily. I mean, it's, no, there's black and white, and that's your job to lead by example. And you can see that in people's work habits, and that should permanently disqualify you from a board or a C-level position, any position. I mean, I've fired people for $12 expense things. Oh, it was an error. No, it wasn't. You're gone. You know, get real.
John, you've probably written many of these, hopefully not the generic versions, and done many searches. You want to kind of weigh in on the skills and competencies kind of profiles?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of, if we poll the room, we had enough time, I think we probably could get 80 to 90% of the right, you know, integrity, smart, you know, good judgment, some relevant domain experience, hopefully, in whatever the company is doing, or whatever, if it's a nonprofit, whatever the nonprofit's doing. But I'm a big fan of, I collect quotes. By the way, it's a great hobby because I don't have to tell my wife how much I'm spending, because I'm spending zero on my hobby. But one of my favorites is from Harper's Magazine with Eugene O'Neill, American playwright, passed away now, but he made the comments in an interview with Harper Magazine that he said, listen, if I can figure out the ending, I can work back from there to write the play. And I think that's what you were saying. If we could figure out what are we trying to achieve, I think everybody has said that. What are you trying to achieve? What do we need to be in 2 years, in 5 years, in 3, you know, in 10 years? Do we need to transform our company from, if you're a software company, if we have a perpetual license model, do we need to go to a SaaS? And what's that transformation really going to have? You know, and I know Brad could talk about what the financial implications are, which can be very, very tough. You can go through a couple of very tough years in that kind of a transition. However, you know, who has experience doing that? But if you determine where you need to be, then you can work back to write that spec. And I think there are going to be some common aspects to it. But, you know, to me, again, I hate to harp on this, but I think the intellectual capacity to think about multivariate issues, multidisciplinary issues, is something that frequently does not show up on the spec. Something also doesn't show up on the spec, I'm always surprised, is does this person know how to make money? It's something, you know, it sounds like too much in the vernacular. Say it that way, demonstrated capability, we've all seen how it's written. But frequently, that doesn't show up on a CEO spec. I'm blown away by not seeing it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. If you want to do the app, I'll fund it. I'll just put it out there, succession planning app.
I was just going to add that, you know, the 3 sets of qualities that I've seen is, number one is their ability to, you know, the core values. I totally agree with that, because if you have a brilliant person who lacks integrity, I mean, we've all gone through the, you know, various scandals that have hit corporate America, so I think we understand what that means. The second key category for me is their ability to connect dots, and that's John's point about intellectual capacity. You want somebody to see the big picture, connect the various areas of domain expertise, and really be able to paint a picture. And then thirdly, it's their ability to be decisive and make the right judgment call. And that is, of course, something that is subjective, because you observe the person, you interview people. I love your mentoring concept, because it gives you insight into that. But these are not sort of easy to look at a checklist and just sort of tick off. At the end of the day, it comes through conversations with them, seeing them in action, having dinner with them, seeing them in formal settings, informal settings. But in my experience, it's particularly under pressure that you can really see those qualities. When things are really tough, they manifest themselves.
Yeah, question? Yeah.
Thank you for this fascinating panel. I'm curious about whether the implications of Creative Commons licensing and maybe the open software movement, the free software movement, might give different outcomes to your observation about succession planning. I'm asking this in the context of developing World University and School like Wikipedia in 300 languages with MIT OpenCourseWare in at least 8 languages. So Wikipedia, MIT OpenCourseWare are all Creative Commons licensed. It gives rise to different choices, perhaps. The money-making aspects, fundraising is still important, but it's not profit-making. What could you bring to bear to
Great question.
CEOs?
Can we develop a CEO succession app? It would be, no, I'm kidding.
My instant reaction to your question is I think that's a very important one because I think it's going to become increasingly key going forward. But I think that it'll be more of an organic process. In other words, things bubble up in that kind of an open source context. I mean, if you just go to an organization like Mozilla, for example, which was one of the very early open source kind of movements, you will see that sort of organic dynamics at work. So I think we're going to see a different breed and a different category of succession. At least that's how
and I think, the bottom line, it's people, right? I mean, every asset, regardless of what company you're involved in, it's the people, right? We make IP and chips, and, Facebook does their IP a different way. Until artificial intelligence is really there, which I'm having a dirt nap, before that ever comes to reality. That's why it's so difficult, hiring and personnel. But what you're touching on, and I see it, I just turned 50, and I used to be one of these up and young and comers, and I don't feel that anywhere because things are changing. And you, whether you're in the C-suite or the board, you have to understand what the hell's going on and change with it. Recruiting and retaining people is a full-time job for executives, period. A CEO should be a coach and a mentor, right? You think Jeff Immelt at GE knows what the hell's going on in 40 divisions? He doesn't. But he attracts, retains, mentors, and supervises some great people. And that's what you need to get to, regardless of the size of your company. And here we have a lot of small companies where you have to touch everything, but you have to mature. And most people have a hard time maturing in those roles. How do I identify with the janitor as well as a board member?
Yeah, in the back.
How and to what extent to address diversity, not just for the CEO, but for the whole executive suite, particularly when you have boards or an executive team who are extremely similar?
Would you like to start?
Oh my God.
I need to go.
There's a reason you're here.
God, I'm like the wildebeest.
I think there's two ways to look at diversity. I think that the way I like to look at it is diversity is healthy for a robust discussion, for that multidisciplinary point of view, John, that you were talking about, looking at things through different angles. I think that's the correct way to look at diversity. It actually makes sense for the organization to have people from different backgrounds, genders, cultures, points of view. I think where diversity gets stuck is when you look at it as something in the same spirit as compliance, i.e., I need to show that my board or my C-suite has diversity, so I'm going to go for somebody who has the diversity credentials to do that. And I think, in the media, that whole argument is, in my view, not portrayed in the right way. People talk about metrics and measures and numbers as opposed to look at, it makes sense. We want to avoid groupthink. We don't want everybody to think the same way. And I can tell you, the boards that I'm part of, we're very fortunate to be extremely diverse in our backgrounds and the way we look at the world and the questions we ask, and that leads to a very robust, healthy discussion. We don't always agree, and that's very healthy because we examine things from different points of view. So it doesn't quite answer your question, but I just wanted to qualify that when we use that word, we can mean different things, and that's the way I'd like to look
I think
at it.
Brad hit it. I'm a simple Midwestern guy myself, but south of the border, you know. But the
How'd you get in then?
but the thing that I find amazing about the diversity, you don't have to make a business case for diversity. I find that literature just to be sort of insane. That, you know, do companies that have more diverse boards, do they do better? Brad hit it. It's all about people. Now, if you're a smart business guy, you can either be interested in diversity or not. Why would you lop off half the smart people and sort of, you know, try to scramble for what's left? I mean, it just seems to me to be such a simple idea that if you're serious about shareholder value, regardless of how you feel about the thing, it's just from an economic side, but it also has the feel-good side to it as well. It's all about people.
I would say 100%. I mean, our jobs as running public companies, our first duty is to maximize shareholder return. And I'll tell you, as a guy that deals with them, all of every big one you can think of, and there's a few social responsible funds that have a different mandate, they want maximum returns, and it's our job to get there. And you nailed it, right? I mean, again, I don't want to keep going back. It's so competitive here. I mean, you could have green hair, be, you know, transgender, and have five noses, and if you're good, we'd hire you, because you need the people to do the stuff, and they're changing, and the world is global right now. I mean, we look at candidates on every board. I mean, we try to include it, but we're going for the best.
But look at it,
Period.
The world is global. If your customers come from different parts of the world, if your employees come from different parts of the world, why wouldn't your C-suite, why wouldn't your board come from different backgrounds? So I think it's people, it's common sense, but I think sometimes we overdress it up in this other argument.
Yeah, question here?
Less of a question, more of an observation.
Sure.
You can respond to the board a bit. I would say my own experience has been that having board members and CEOs having candid, honest, heart-to-heart conversations throughout the process, not just the succession planning process, but the board meetings, having those kind of candid, authentic conversations is critically important when it comes to being able to assess how realistic a success is.
That's right.
The CEO is typically very invested in their proposals. The board members, if they want to go along to get along, are not necessarily going to push back too hard until a decision point comes later. So those kind of candid conversations throughout the process, I think, are very valuable. I think the second observation I have is that when we choose one or two individuals to be potential successors, we've then got to put our money where our mouth is and put those individuals into rotational assignments and experiences that truly will prepare them
That's right.
for becoming CEO. And oftentimes that can be disruptive for the organization in the interim. And then I think my third observation, one that's, that I found to be very difficult, is when the successor is ready before the CEO is ready to go.
Yeah.
And so managing the timing and conversations around all of that often proves to be difficult.
Yeah. Yeah, all great points. I'll turn over to the panel, but I think it's been kind of interesting. If you look backward, the COO role has always been the, you know, CEO in waiting, and it's kind of an odd position now. We're getting rid of that, but and you guys probably know what I'm talking about. But there is one case where the CEO said, "Okay, 2 years," and they brought this guy in, and the COO was doing all the CEO work, and the CEO was basically dealing with the big shareholders and doing the annual meeting, and the company's doing well, and it's about 3 months before the handover, and he comes to the board and says, "You know, this is a lot of fun. I'd like to stay on for another couple of years." And then I know in that case, you know, how do you make that decision? I mean, it's hard to have a candid decision when that's dialed up. In that case, the lead director basically talked to the CEO. They were personal friends and said, "Look, we've been in this company a long time. Why don't we both leave and get a fresh start?" So he basically threw himself over the side and took the CEO with him, and that's how that transpired. But let me turn it over. Yeah.
Well, I'll just make the observation. I mean, I think this does touch on this point I raised earlier around the delegation, right? Because ultimately, the board needs to really own the process for CEO succession, and I don't believe they should own the process for the CO team or the E staff, but they obviously need to be intimately familiar because it is one level away, as we say. So, but that doesn't always happen, right? I mean, you have a lot of instances where it's a bit window dressing, and I think that's problematic for a lot of the reasons. But, you know, again, looking at this as an optimist, I think the good news is there are trends that are, look, board members have been asked to do a whole lot more in the last decade, right? I mean, ever since Sarbanes-Oxley, I think the role has changed dramatically. I think it will continue to change. I don't know if it's going to be on the same sort of trajectory than it has been, but definitely there's some serious changes out there when you think about how professional investors are looking to get more information around the succession process, how the regulators are looking more, the credit agencies and so forth. So I think that's something that will lead to, you know, some of these other issues have been raised around sort of who owns the process, other adjacent issues, important ones around diversity. I think these are going to start looking a lot different in the years to come. I think the conversations in forums like this will be quite different.
And I just one final point on your third point, Eddie, which is, you know, the CEO says, oops, I'm not ready to go. You know, it reminds me of President Eisenhower's quote, and I'm not saying it correctly, but he said something like, plans are useless and planning is everything. And the point here is frequent conversations, and that's why the frequency of conversations about succession at the board level is very important, because you can tap into those sentiments and you can be proactive about making those interventions just in time. Whereas if you leave it till once a year, et cetera, it may be too late to catch up with that expectation. So,
yeah, one thing that always comes up, I ask the panel, what should be the role of the outgoing CEO in the succession planning exercise? You know, ideas about that?
Yeah, I'll take a cut at that. I'm a big believer that unless there is some extraordinary circumstance, it would be ideal for the CEO to totally extract themselves.
Totally extract.
Totally extract themselves from the company. That means leave the board. There are circumstances, you know, for instance, at Google, Eric Schmidt stepped up to be executive chairman, and Larry Page is, you know, CEO running the company. That seems to be working well from talking to some of their board members. So that's a model that can work. There are models, other models of another local company, Intuit, which has recruited Bill Campbell, I think, for Scott Cook when they were about 50, 60 million. Bill is still the non-executive chair of the company. He served as CEO for a number of years. Scott's still on the board. And Steve Bennett, who was a successful CEO, had a 5 or 6 year run, very successful run at Intuit, was on the board when Brad Smith, which is who Steve recruited to succeed him. So Brad came into the role, and he has 3 former CEOs on the board, and it worked. So there are unique circumstances where these things can work, and there's still Steve is gone, but Brad still has 2 former CEOs on the board, and it works. So there are circumstances where things can work if people are very sensitive to the issues. There are circumstances where people should leave, I think, and people that do want to hang on can be a serious problem, particularly if the person is pushed out or if the company has lost its mojo, has lost its momentum in the market. Having an insular point of view and having your former boss sitting at the boardroom, it's hard to bring up the tough issues.
yeah.
So a couple of things, questions that I would suggest those of you who are on boards or may be responsible for succession planning or have a big part of responsibility, because I really believe it is the board and not the CEO's responsibility, but many cases it's delegated to the CEO, is a couple of questions you can ask is, if you have a problem, if you don't think you have enough people, if you're large enough to have people and you don't think you have adequate candidates, is you need to ask the question, how are we arranging to have this problem? You know, sometimes it's a tough question. You know, we are, as a group, a board, we're arranging to have this problem. How are we allowing ourselves to have this problem? And that's a delicate question, and it's a tough question because it really hits it head on. The other one is, are we pursuing excellence, or are we pursuing the median? Are we pursuing good enough, or we are pursuing the Brad talked about getting that best person. And of course, what is best? Is it materially better or is it just slightly better? And of course, we always say unless a person is really materially better, you would never go outside. You would always stay inside. But materially is the issue that people need to discuss. But there are two questions you can ask. Are we pursuing excellence or mediocrity or average? Because a lot of companies can get into a groove of being cruise control. They could be pursuing average. And then how are we arranging to have this problem?
You know, the one thing I would say that would be useful to, maybe two pieces, most useful to have an outgoing CEO play a role in is, number one, defining the future requirements for that role. I mean, they've sat there, so they understand what it's all about. Now, not solely, right, but having them weigh in on that process. And the other part I think is really important is helping to identify potential candidates, right? Because think of the network that the existing CEO has outside of the organization, across the industry. It's pretty tremendous. And not to sort of leverage that and think about that and pull ideas that might come from that is certainly a lost opportunity. But I think that's essentially where it ends, right? So anything that starts bleeding into the selection process itself is going to be fraught with issues, I think, to have involvement in any sort of formal way. I mean, there's always informal involvement as an advisor, but any sort of formal way, I think you're talking about some tricky situations.
I agree. You got to do it so quick because internally, and if you're a bigger company, it is so confusing.
Yeah.
Right, I went through it myself. Like we did a 2-month transition. You know, he's officially, you know, and well, do I go to him? Do I go to you? What do I do? And I'm just like, okay, you're signing everything. You're making anything new, anything old past this date. It's my decision. Anything new is yours. And it got very confusing. And then he's officially the guy now. But just like you said, you know, I've had 3 emails today and a call. You know, hey, what do you think? Should I, you know, give me some history? And that's going to go on for a period of time, but we're fortunate to have planned it and have that. You generally don't have that luxury. The guy's blown out the door. He's going to some new company in 2 weeks, and, you know, you're off to the races, right? Yeah.
Okay, one last question. Yeah.
I've had a lot of experience in looking at military history. And if you look at something like Pickett's charge
Battlefield promotion.
companies that were going through bankruptcy or extreme, retrenchment, is that it is so much easier to run things because you don't have to worry about diversity, you don't have to worry about sacred cause, you don't have to worry about organizational charge. You're just looking for
Survival.
guys willing to step up.
Yeah.
And you could whack 50 people at a time. You hate to do that because you don't want to do that. But you find out who will rise to the occasion. And you talk to some guy and says, what you're doing today completely, you've got to do something completely different. This is your job. And you see how they handle it. And what's frustrating is when you get into organizations that are the same and they move so slowly,
Yeah.
it takes so long to do it. It's almost better. And I just sort of seek out opportunities where guys are under extreme distress because it's so much quicker than having to go through this process. And you get opportunities
That's a great.
you don't get otherwise to assume leadership.
You want to come on our board?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The interim CFO from the board member because they needed an emergency CFO, and so that was good. And went back to the board after 8 months later. But that was sort of a fun thing because you got called in, you could do it, and it's kind of really a lot of fun. But I think I urge you guys to sort of adopt some of the mentality of sort of this hurry up offense type situation because it really gives you a chance to do things quicker as opposed to taking 5-year plan.
All right. On that Darwinian notion, let me let me ask to thank the panel. I thought they were great.
Thank you.